The grandma who outsmarted the world's largest cartel, the true story of Maria Herrera Magdaleno and her war against Mexico's crisis of the disappeared. She looks like someone's grandmother. She has short grey hair, soft eyes lined with years of grief, and hands worn from decades of labor. When she speaks, her voice is gentle but steady. The voice of a woman who has cried until she could cry no more and found, somewhere on the other side of that grief, a resolve harder than iron. Her name is Maria Herrera Magdaleno, and she is known throughout Mexico simply as Doña Mary. She did not set out to become a human rights activist. She did not plan to challenge the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. She was a businesswoman, a mother of 8. Was this a woman who sold clothes and gold jewelry in the markets of Michoacan and who built, brick by careful brick, a modest but dignified life for her children? Then, one August morning in 2008, 2 of her sons failed to come home, and nothing in the world would ever be the same again. What happened to Doña Mary is not a story of one woman's grief alone. It is the story of more than 112,000 people who have vanished in Mexico since the government declared its so-called war on drugs in 2006. It is the story of a state that failed its citizens, of police who turned their backs or worse, who handed the missing over to the very cartels they were supposed to fight. And it is the story of what happens when a grandmother refuses to accept that silence, when a woman who had never marched in a protest, never addressed a court, when never confronted a government official, decides that she will not rest, that she will travel across a nation soaked in fear and blood, that she will teach herself the skills of a forensic investigator, that she will sue her own government before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and that she will stand before the Pope himself and say, "We are the victims, but we will be the builders of peace." This is the story of the grandma who outsmarted the world's largest cartel, not with a weapon, not with money, not with political power, but with something the cartel has never understood and cannot destroy: the love of a mother and the refusal to disappear. Before we go any further into this extraordinary story, if you find yourself moved by the courage of people like Doña Mary, if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard and remembered, then please consider subscribing to this channel and activating the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Every story we tell here is about real people, real courage, and real history. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful, untold narratives to light. Now, let's go back to the mountains of Michoacan, to the life of an ordinary woman who would become one of the most important human rights voices in the Americas. To understand Maria Herrera Magdaleno, you have to understand where she came from. She was born around 1949 in Pajacuaran, a working-class town in the northeastern corner of Michoacan, a state that sits in western Mexico along the Pacific coast. Michoacan is a land of extraordinary natural beauty: volcanic mountains, butterfly sanctuaries, avocado orchards, and ancient indigenous traditions. It is also a land that has been, for decades, deeply contested by organized crime. Long before the modern cartels rose to dominate the headlines, Michoacan was a place where poor families learned to survive in the margins, where the state was distant and often indifferent, and where the line between survival and crime was sometimes uncomfortably thin. Maria grew up in those margins. She married young, raised 8 children and 2 stepchildren, and by the early 2000s had built a small but successful business. After leaving a marriage she described as troubled, she took full responsibility for her household and became a single mother with the kind of quiet determination that defines women across rural Latin America. She sold clothes, she expanded into gold jewelry. As her business grew, her sons helped her. Life was difficult, but it was hers. And it had, for a time, the shape of something approaching stability and even hope. By 2008, two of her oldest sons, Jesus Salvador, then 24, and Raul, then 19, had become part of the family business. They were goldsmiths and jewelers traveling between states to trade in gold. They were, by all accounts, honest men. They had no ties to organized crime. They were simply working the way their mother had taught them to work, with their hands, with their craftsmanship, with their faith that honest labor had value in this world. In August of 2008, they set off on a business trip to the neighboring state of Guerrero, traveling with 5 colleagues. None of them ever came back. To understand what happened to Jesus Salvador and Raul, you have to understand what was happening in Mexico in 2008. 2 years earlier, President Felipe Calderón had declared war on the drug cartels. It was a decision of enormous consequence, one that would reshape the country for generations. Calderón deployed the Mexican military into the streets of the most violent states, targeting the cartels that had grown to extraordinary power in the preceding decades. The intention was to dismantle these criminal organizations. The result, as many analysts warned at the time, was a massive escalation of violence that would ultimately claim hundreds of thousands of lives and send tens of thousands more into the abyss of forced disappearance. The Sinaloa Cartel are the organization that would eventually come to be recognized by US. The intelligence as the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, more influential even than Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel at its peak, had deep roots in precisely the kind of territory where the Herrera sons were traveling. Its origins traced back to the mountains of Sinaloa, to the poppy fields and marijuana plots that had sustained poor rural families for generations. In the 1960s and 1970s, those family networks began to consolidate into something far more organized. The man who would become its most famous leader, Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera, known to the world as El Chapo, or Shorty, was born in 1957 in the remote hamlet of La Tuna, in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, the same impoverished mountain terrain where his family grew poppies to survive. He was, in his origins, not so different from the rural poor of Michoacán, shaped by hunger, by the absence of the state, by a world in which the only path upward seemed to be paved with violence and crime. By the 1980s, El Chapo had risen through the ranks of the Guadalajara cartel, learning the trade under the tutelage of Pedro Aviles, and later the godfather of Mexican drug trafficking, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. When that cartel fractured in the late 1980s, partly in the aftermath of the 1985 assassination of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, which unleashed American pressure that could no longer be ignored, El Chapo and his associates established their own base in Sinaloa, forming the foundations of what would become the most dominant criminal organization in Mexican history. Through the 1990s, the Sinaloa cartel expanded relentlessly. Till it fought bloody wars against the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, and eventually the Zetas and the Beltran Leyva organization. It bribed politicians, military commanders, and law enforcement at every level. US Treasury officials would later call Guzman the world's most powerful drug trafficker. Forbes magazine estimated his personal net worth at over $1 billion. The cartel's annual revenues were estimated to range anywhere from $3 to $39 billion, a figure that exceeded the GDP of many countries. It operated in at least 40 countries worldwide. It controlled, according to some estimates, between 40 and 60% of Mexico's entire drug trade. It corrupted institutions from the street-level police officer as would later be alleged in a US federal courtroom, the highest offices of state. Or it was into this world that Jesus Salvador and Raul Herrera traveled in August of 2008. Guerrero, the state where they went to trade gold, was not peripheral to the cartel wars, and it was central to them. Control over its mountain passes, its port cities, and its rural corridors was fiercely contested, and in that contested space, the line between legitimate traveler and target for extortion, kidnapping, or worse, had become impossible to draw with any certainty. The authorities, who Maria Herrera would later approach for help, acknowledged only that her sons had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what emerged over the following years was a far more disturbing picture. That local police, corrupt and entangled with organized crime, may have played a direct role in what happened to them. When her sons did not return, our Maria Herrera did what any mother would do. She called, she waited, she called again. She filed reports with local police, who told her nothing. She filed reports with state authorities, who told her nothing. She hired private detectives. She drove herself at her own expense through dangerous territory, asking questions at checkpoints and in village squares where even the act of asking questions could get a person killed. She was consumed by a grief that she would later describe as the worst and most painful thing you can imagine. A grief not of death, which at least offers the terrible finality of a grave, but of absolute uncertainty, the open wound of not knowing. For 2 years, she searched. For 2 years, she received nothing from the Mexican state. No meaningful investigation, no leads, no accountability. But the official response to her reports was, at best, bureaucratic indifference and, at worst, active obstruction. In a country where cartels had penetrated every level of law enforcement, the act of searching for a disappeared person was itself an act of defiance. And defiance, in that world, could cost you everything. Then in 2010, the blow she had been dreading fell again. This time, doubled. 2 more of her sons, Gustavo, then 28, and Luis Armando, then 25, disappeared. They had been traveling through the eastern state of Veracruz on a business trip. Like their brothers, they were honest men with no ties to organized crime. They had, in fact, spent the previous 2 years helping their mother search for Jesus Salvador and Raul, crisscrossing the country, asking questions, following leads. It was, according to information the family would later obtain, precisely that searching that had made them targets. Corrupt police, aware that 2 young men were investigating disappearances in cartel-controlled territory, allegedly intercepted them and handed them over to the Zetas cartel, one of the most brutal criminal organizations in Mexico, known for its extreme violence and its capacity to make people vanish without a trace. Maria Herrera had now lost 4 of her 8 sons. A nephew and one of her grandsons would also subsequently disappear. She was a woman of modest means, without political connections, without legal expertise, without any of the resources that most people would consider necessary to challenge the most powerful criminal and governmental structures in Mexico. And she chose, nonetheless, to fight. And the turning point came in 2011 when Maria attended a protest in Morelia, the capital of Michoacán, led by the poet and activist Javier Sicilia. Sicilia had lost his own son to cartel violence. His son had been murdered, like so many others, in the expanding spiral of the drug war. Sicilia had responded to this loss by becoming one of the most visible voices in Mexico, demanding an end to the violence and accountability from the government. He organized a march for peace that drew together thousands of families shattered by the same catastrophe. The disappearance and murder of children, siblings, parents, and spouses in a conflict that seemed to have no end and no justice. When Maria Herrera stood up at that gathering and spoke, when she told the crowd what had happened to her 4 sons. When she described the wall of silence and indifference she had encountered from every official she had approached. The response she heard was something she had not expected. Thousands of voices cried out to her, "You are not alone! You are not alone!" She has described that moment as the one that changed everything. For the first time since August 2008, she was not an isolated woman screaming into a void. She was part of something larger, part of a community of grief and resistance that crossed state lines, that transcended the individual stories of thousands of Mexican families, that constituted together a demand that could not be so easily ignored. In the years that followed, Maria Herrera transformed that moment into a movement. She began traveling across Mexico, meeting other families of the disappeared, listening to their stories and sharing her own. She organized conferences, she approached universities and convinced professors of anthropology and forensic science to teach ordinary citizens, most of them mothers and grandmothers, how to search for clandestine graves. She taught herself and then taught others how to drive a metal rod into the soil to detect the smell of decomposing flesh, how to use a pick and shovel without destroying bone evidence, how to read the landscape for signs of disturbed earth, how to collect and preserve remains for identification. She became, in the most literal sense, an expert in finding the dead, because in Mexico, that was what the search for the disappeared had become. In 2013, the Trujillo Herrera family, Maria's family, established a collective called Familiares en Búsqueda María Herrera, Relatives in Search. The following year, in 2014, Maria founded the Red de Colectivos, a national network of local groups that brought together families of the disappeared from across the country. That network grew with extraordinary speed. By the time it was mature, it encompassed nearly 200 collectives spread across 26 of Mexico's 31 states. The movement that had begun in a room where a poet wept for his murdered son now reached into the most remote corners of a country where over 100,000 people had simply ceased to exist. To fully grasp what Maria Herrera was fighting, it is necessary to understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that the Mexican war on drugs produced. When President Calderón deployed the military in December 2006, he set in motion a chain of events whose consequences would dwarf anything that had come before. The cartels did not retreat in the face of military pressure. They escalated. They recruited more aggressively, armed themselves more heavily, and turned their violence not just against rivals, but against the fabric of civilian society itself. Journalists were killed in record numbers. Lawyers who represented cartel victims were assassinated. Activists who organized families of the disappeared were murdered. And in the terror that this violence produced, the statistics of the disappeared grew year by year, month by month, like a wound that no one in power seemed willing or able to close. By the time Maria Herrera began building her network, the official registry of the disappeared in Mexico had reached numbers that strained comprehension. Over 76,000 disappearances had been recorded since 1968, and nearly 98% of them had occurred after 2006. More than 300,000 murders had been attributed to organized crime in the same period. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described the situation as a humanitarian crisis. Human Rights Watch documented systemic abuses by both cartel members and government security forces, including enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. By 2022, the National Search Commission placed the number of officially recognized missing persons at over 112,000, a figure that, experts noted, likely represented a significant undercount. Given widespread reluctance to report to authorities, who were themselves often complicit in the violence. What Maria Herrera understood from her own experience and from the thousands of families she worked with was that the crisis had a specific and terrible shape. It was not random. The disappeared were overwhelmingly poor, working-class people from rural states, people without political connections, without money to pay lawyers, without access to the networks of power that might make a missing person's case a priority rather than a number in a database. They were, in short, people like her sons. And the system's failure to find them, or even to seriously search for them, was not merely bureaucratic incapacity. It was, she came to understand, a reflection of something deeper, a corruption so pervasive, so it's a collusion between the criminal and the official so intimate that justice had become structurally impossible for the most vulnerable. This was what she said to newspapers, it was what she said to government officials, it was what she said to the United Nations, and it was eventually what she said to the Pope. In the years following 2013, Maria Herrera's activism escalated in reach and ambition. She was not content to organize searches in the field, though she continued to do that, personally participating in the excavation of clandestine graves, standing over the bones of strangers' children and helping to give them back their names. She also moved on to the terrain of international advocacy, bringing Mexico's crisis of disappearances to every forum that would hear her. She traveled to the United States Congress, where she testified about the role of American guns in Mexican cartel violence. Mexico has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the world. Its only legal gun store is located on a military base in Mexico City. But across the border, in states with loose gun regulations like Texas and Arizona, the flow of weapons into Mexico was, as she told American lawmakers, fueling the mass kidnappings and murders that were destroying her country. The cartel's arsenals, military-grade weapons that outgunned local police, and sometimes even the army, came overwhelmingly from north of the border. Her testimony placed a human face on a crisis that too easily became a matter of abstract policy debate. She worked with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, whose office recognized her courage and her leadership. But a UN staff member described sitting with her in the kitchen of her home in Tepoztlán, in the state of Mexico, as she prepared food for a day's search. Stews and casseroles for the volunteers who would spend the day driving metal rods into the earth looking for her sons. Michelle Bachelet, the former UN High Commissioner, visited Mexico in 2018 and specifically noted the courage of the families of the victims who have been key actors in organizing and proposing solutions and achieving legal and institutional advances. She confronted the Mexican government at every level, filing complaints, demanding investigations, attending congressional hearings, and refusing, absolutely refusing, to accept the silence that power had used to bury the crisis. When she approached the offices of the Federal Attorney General, she was given a car by a sympathetic congresswoman from Guerrero to make the journey. A small act of solidarity in a landscape largely devoid of it. She spent her own savings. She exhausted herself physically and emotionally. She lost count of the clandestine graves she had helped excavate, the bones she had helped identify, the families she had helped find, at least the terrible closure of knowing. None of those bones in all those years had been the bones of her sons. In May of 2022, Maria Herrera Magdaleno sat before Pope Francis at the Vatican. It was a moment of extraordinary symbolic power. A grandmother from Michoacán, a woman who had never imagined herself walking the marble floors of the Holy See, sitting before the leader of the world's largest Christian denomination and telling him what was happening in Mexico. She carried with her not just her own story, but the stories of 100,000 families. She told the Pope about the disappeared, she told him about the clandestine graves, She told him about the corrupt police who handed innocent people to cartels, about the government that did not investigate, about the mothers and grandmothers who drove metal rods into the earth because there was no one else to do it. And she told him something else. She told him, "We are the victims, but it is precisely because of this situation that we must become builders of peace." It was a statement that encapsulated everything about who she had become. Not a woman broken by grief, though the grief was real, and it was enormous. Not a woman consumed by rage, though the injustice was staggering, but a woman who had chosen consciously and deliberately to transform her suffering into something constructive, to build, from the wreckage of her family, a movement that could protect others. The Pope received her. He listened. He offered his prayers and his solidarity. And Maria Herrera returned to Mexico and continued her work. The most audacious act of her long campaign came in November of 2022, when Maria Herrera Magdaleno filed a lawsuit against the Mexican state before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Washington, D.C. It was a step that few individuals ever take, a formal legal challenge before an international tribunal, accusing a government of failing to investigate the disappearances of her sons and of potentially being complicit in those disappearances through the corruption of its law enforcement agencies. The lawsuit was not only about her 4 missing sons, though it was that too. It was about the systemic failure of the Mexican state to address the crisis of enforced disappearance, a failure that the family had documented with painstaking care over 14 years of searching, filing complaints, and watching official after official look the other way. According to information that Maria and her surviving children had compiled, all 4 of her sons' disappearances had involved local police who had ties to organized crime. In the case of Gustavo and Luis Armando, the evidence suggested that they had been intercepted by police and handed directly to the Zetas cartel, a cartel notorious for its extreme brutality and its practice of using corrupt law enforcement as a conduit for kidnapping and murder. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights represents the highest judicial body in the Americas for human rights cases. Cases brought before it require exhausting domestic remedies first, a condition that Maria Herrera had more than satisfied, having spent 14 years navigating every level of the Mexican justice system without result. The lawsuit represented the culmination of that long journey through institutions that had failed her, a final assertion that if Mexico would not investigate, then an international court would compel it to answer. In April 2023, Time magazine named Maria Herrera Magdaleno to its annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. She appeared alongside King Charles III, Beyoncé, and Elon Musk, figures whose influence derived from wealth, celebrity, and political power. But hers derived from something altogether different, from the fact that a small woman with grey hair and a mother's grief had, against every conceivable obstacle, built a movement that had changed how Mexico and the world understood the crisis of disappearances. Time described her as leading a 1,000-strong movement that no one wants to join, a phrase that captured with terrible precision the nature of the network she had built. No one joins a collective of families searching for their disappeared children because they want to. They join because they have no other choice, because the state has failed them, because the alternative is silence, and silence is intolerable. The nearly 200 collectives that Maria's network encompassed were each a testament to the inadequacy of official institutions and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people who refused to accept that their loved ones simply did not matter. The recognition from Time, from the United Nations, from the Inter-American Court, from the Vatican, all of it was significant not because it changed what had happened to her sons, but because it changed what was possible for others. Every time a grandmother from Michoacán was recognized on a global stage as one of the most influential people on the planet, the visibility of Mexico's crisis of the disappeared grew. Every documentary, every interview, every international award made it harder for the Mexican government to continue pretending the problem was under control. Visibility, but Maria Herrera had learned, was its own form of power. And power, wielded carefully and relentlessly, could protect lives. It would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging the price that people like Maria Herrera pay for their courage. The work of the Madres Buscadoras, the searching mothers, is not merely emotionally devastating, it is physically dangerous. In a country where cartel operatives and corrupt police overlap in ways that make it impossible to know who is watching or who is reporting back to whom, the act of searching for the disappeared, of finding the graves of cartel victims, of speaking publicly about what has been found, all of this carries risk. In 2016, while El Chapo was imprisoned in Mexico, awaiting extradition, and the cartel wars continued unabated, armed men broke into Maria Herrera's own home. She was unharmed, but 3 nearby residents were killed. Vehicles and motorcycles were stolen. Telephone lines were cut. The message was clear. The fact that you are a grandmother, the fact that you are a woman in her 60s, searching for her sons does not protect you. Nothing protects you. The cartels have demonstrated time and again their willingness to kill anyone who poses a threat. And a woman who has organized 200 collectives testified before the US Congress and sued the Mexican state before an international court is, by any measure, a threat. Other women in the movement have not been as fortunate as Maria Herrera. Teresa Magueyal, a mother in Guanajuato, searching for her disappeared son, was shot and killed in broad daylight in May 2023. Since 2022, at least 5 other women searching for missing family members have been murdered in Mexico. The Inter-American Court has issued protective measures for families and activists at risk. Human rights organizations have demanded that the Mexican government provide security for those doing the work that the state refuses to do. And still the searching continues. In the heat, in the dust, with metal rods and shovels, and the quiet, terrible expertise of people who never wanted to know how to find the dead. To fully understand what Maria Herrera and the families she represents are up against, it is necessary to appreciate the full scope of the Sinaloa cartel's power. A power that did not diminish simply because El Chapo was captured and imprisoned, nor even when he was extradited to the United States in 2017 and convicted in 2019. He's sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years in order to forfeit more than $12.5 billion in assets. The Sinaloa cartel has survived precisely because it was never really about one man. Unlike more hierarchical organizations, Sinaloa operates, as analysts have noted for decades, more like a federation than a pyramid, a network of allied organizations that cooperate, share routes and resources, and protect each other, while maintaining enough independence to survive the loss of any individual node. When El Chapo was first arrested in 1993 in Guatemala, the cartel continued. When he escaped from prison in 2001 in a laundry basket, the cartel had continued without him. When he was captured again in 2014, the cartel continued. When he escaped again in 2015 through a mile-long tunnel equipped with lighting, or ventilation, and even a motorcycle, in one of the most audacious prison breaks in history, and one that humiliated the Mexican government internationally, the cartel was already operating at full capacity. By the time El Chapo was finally extradited to the United States in January 2017, the cartel's operational infrastructure had been largely transferred to other hands, to his partner Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and to his sons, known as Los Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo Jesus Alfredo, Joaquin, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez. The Chapitos, according to the DEA and US prosecutors, were not merely heirs to their father's empire. They were its modernizers, transforming the cartel's operations to make fentanyl the centerpiece of its product line, flooding the United States with the synthetic opioid that would go on to kill over 100,000 Americans per year. They were indicted by US authorities in April 2023 on charges of large-scale drug trafficking, money laundering, and violent crimes. They became, in the eyes of US law enforcement, the architects of the deadliest drug epidemic in American history. In July 2024, in a stunning development, El Mayo Zambada himself, the last of the old-school cartel bosses, a man who had evaded capture for decades while his partners were arrested and extradited one by one, was arrested by US authorities in El Paso, Texas. The circumstances were extraordinary. One of El Chapo's sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, had allegedly lured Zambada to Sinaloa under false pretenses, subdued him, and put him on a plane to the United States, apparently as part of a deal struck with the US Department of Justice. The betrayal, if that is what it was, sent shockwaves through the cartel and triggered a new wave of violence in Sinaloa and surrounding states. In February 2025, the Trump administration designated the Sinaloa Cartel and its rival, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, as foreign terrorist organizations, a designation with profound implications for how the United States could respond to their operations. And yet, throughout all of this, through the arrests and escapes and betrayals and designations, the over 112,000 disappeared, remain disappeared. The clandestine graves remain to be found. The families of the missing remain waiting for answers that may never come. The corruption that makes mass disappearance possible remains embedded in institutions from the village police station to the Federal Attorney General's office. The war that was declared in 2006 to end the cartel's power has produced instead the greatest human rights crisis in Mexico's modern history. Against this backdrop, the significance of what Maria Herrera Magdaleno has built becomes clearer. She did not defeat the Sinaloa cartel. She did not end the war on drugs or the corruption that sustains it. She did not find her sons. And as of the time of this writing, Jesus Salvador, Raul, Gustavo, and Luis Armando Herrera remain among the over 112,000 missing. Every search she has participated in, every grave she has helped excavate, has yielded the bones of someone else's child, not hers. And she has given those families something priceless: the knowledge of what happened, the possibility of burial and mourning, while her own grief remains permanently open. What she has built is something different from victory. It is infrastructure. It is the kind of durable, distributed institution that survives even when the individuals at its center are exhausted or threatened or taken. The Red de Colectivos, out of the network of nearly 200 search collectives across 26 states, did not exist before she built it. The knowledge of how to search for clandestine graves, how to identify remains, how to pressure official institutions through international mechanisms. This knowledge did not exist in accessible, transferable form for ordinary Mexican families before she and her network created it. Of the visibility that the movement has given to the crisis of disappearances has forced the Mexican government, at least at times, to respond, to create the National Search Commission, to fund forensic teams, to pass laws that, however inadequately enforced, at least acknowledge the scale of what has happened. She has also changed something harder to measure: the culture of silence that the cartels depend on. When families know they are not alone, when they know there is a network of support and a body of expertise and an international community watching, they are less likely to disappear into their grief privately and more likely to organize, to speak, to search. Every family that finds the courage to report a disappearance, to participate in a collective, to give testimony to an international court, is a small erosion of the impunity that the cartels need to operate. Impunity, as any scholar of organized crime will tell you, is not just a product of corruption. It is a requirement for survival. Take away impunity, and you begin to change the equation. People sometimes ask what weapons a grandmother from Michoacán can bring to a fight against the world's most powerful drug cartel. The question misunderstands what kind of fight this is. The Sinaloa cartel can outgun any grandmother. It can outbribe any government official. It can outspend any legal team. It has, by some estimates, corrupted every level of Mexican law enforcement. It has bribed a president of Honduras. It has operated in 40 countries. It has built tunnels under the US border, equipped with air conditioning. It has catapulted drugs over border walls in pneumatic cannons. It has survived the capture and imprisonment of its most famous leader and the killing or arrest of dozens of its senior operatives. Against an adversary like that, a grandmother's weapons are, in conventional terms, negligible. But the fight that Maria Herrera has chosen is not a conventional one. She is not trying to outgun the Sinaloa cartel or outbribe it. She is doing something far more subversive. She is making it visible. She is insisting against every effort to keep Mexico's disappeared hidden in unmarked graves and unexamined files, that these people existed, that they mattered, that someone, somewhere, is still looking for them. She is building a record that cannot be buried, an international legal case that cannot be dissolved by a bribe to a local magistrate, a movement that cannot be killed because it is not housed in a single person or a single place, but in the collective knowledge and determination of 200 groups spread across 26 states. The cartels rule through fear. What Maria Herrera has spent 16 years teaching is that fear, when transformed by grief and solidarity, can become something else. It can become a kind of courage that does not depend on guns or money or political power. It depends only on refusing, absolutely and completely, to pretend that what is happening is not happening. As of 2024, Maria Herrera, now in her mid-70s, continues her work. She has acknowledged in interviews that she is physically exhausted, that her hands are not strong enough anymore to drive a shovel into the earth herself, that she must pass that work to younger volunteers. But she has not stopped traveling, speaking, organizing, or testifying. She continues to lead her network. She continues to attend international forums. She continues to hold her government accountable through legal mechanisms that she, a woman who sold clothes in the markets of Michoacán, taught herself to navigate. Her lawsuit before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights remains active. The question of what happened to her 4 sons, Jesus Salvador, Raúl, Gustavo, and Luis Armando, has still not been answered by any official investigation. The Mexican state has still not provided accountability for the corruption that, in all probability, played a role in their disappearances. But the fact that the question is now being asked before an international tribunal, before judges with the authority to compel responses from a sovereign government, is itself a kind of answer. The answer that Maria Herrera has spent 16 years constructing one painstaking, dangerous, heartbreaking step at a time. She has said in one of her most quoted statements that finding her sons is what is left for me to be able to die in peace. She has not found them. She does not know if she ever will, but she has done something that may ultimately matter more. She has ensured that the story of what happened to them, and to the 100,000 others who vanished alongside them, will not die in silence. She has built from her grief an institution. She has forged from her love a weapon. And she has demonstrated, to anyone who cares to pay attention, that the grandma with grey hair and a mother's determination can do something that billions of dollars and thousands of armed men cannot quite manage to stop. She can tell the truth. The world's largest cartel controls drug routes from Colombia to Chicago. It employs tens of thousands of members across 40 countries. It has the resources to bribe governments and the firepower to wage wars. It has demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who stands in its way. And yet a woman in her 70s, born in a working-class town in Michoacán, who never planned to become an activist, who just wanted her sons to come home, this woman has compelled it to be seen. She has dragged it into the light of international scrutiny. She has built a movement that endures. She has stood before a Pope and a United Nations Commissioner and a US Congressional Committee and the Inter-American Court, and she has said, "Here is what is happening. You cannot pretend you do not know." That is the story of the grandma who outsmarted the world's largest cartel. Not by matching its violence, not by matching its money, but by doing the one thing that all the money and all the guns in the world cannot do, by refusing with absolute and implacable love to make the disappeared disappear. The names of her 4 missing sons are Jesus Salvador Herrera, Raúl Herrera Trujillo, Gustavo Herrera Trujillo, and Luis Armando Herrera Trujillo. They have not been found. Their mother is still looking.